started. So thank you everyone who has joined so far. I hope you're having a great day so far. We do have an exciting session planned for today, but I'll get the quick housekeeping notes, as I mentioned, out of the way. Quick intro on me. I'm John Carlo from the marketing team at Just. I'll be passing things over to our speakers in just a moment, but I do want to lead with these brief notes. There will be a recording shared with registrants after the webinar is over. So keep your eyes out for your email inbox for when the webinar ends, and we will be sending the recording over shortly after the end. And we will be hosting a short Q&A at the end of this discussion today, so we definitely encourage you to pop any questions you may have along the way into the dedicated Q&A feature on Zoom. We will try to get as many as we can, but this is the best way to ensure that your questions do get answered. Now, with my notes out of the way, let's get started. I'm very excited to introduce Roenen our co-founder and chief risk officer at Just, as well as Sarah Boehmer, who is the senior director of payments and chargeback strategy at Just. Very excited to be here with you both today. And Roenen, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, JC, and super excited to be here again with you guys. I'm really starting to enjoy these webinars, 30-minute webinars, coming in with some really strong, concrete points that everybody should be thinking about. Makes it efficient and keeps us focused, make sure we're not wasting your time either. So we have a really exciting session today. We're going to be talking about VAMP ratios as well as alerts and chargeback recovery strategy and how that all works together, because they're all great processes. You need to understand the ins and outs of them and to balance it right so you can get your ratios right, but also recover the funds that you deserve to recover in the chargeback process, which can be a challenge that we'll talk about through the process. Quick introduction about myself. For those who don't know me, I'm Roenen, co-founder and chief risk officer here at Just. I'm sure you guys all know Just, the chargeback solution at the post-transaction stage, dealing with those illegitimate first-party misuse chargebacks using smart technology to actually dynamically represent each and every case based off of its specific scenario with what we call dynamic arguments, and then optimizing and improving the results over time. So you get tailored results at scale and improvements over time. And I have here with me Sarah. Sarah, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Ronan. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I work on payments and chargeback strategy at Just. So I work with our merchants to help them get the best performance out of Just and come up with the best chargeback strategy tailored for their business. And before this, I used to be a Just client, so I have a lot of hands-on experience with the product and just with VAMP and alerts and the whole payments ecosystem in general.
Thank you, Sarah. So what is the agenda today? We're really going to start with the evolution of the chargeback handling process and what we've seen throughout the years with what technology and understanding in the industry really created a place to build something better and different in the market. But then there's also the whole process of alerts and when to use alerts, how to use alerts, and deciding how to balance that with your chargeback process. So we'll dive into that as well. And Sarah is going to dive us into the whole process of VAMP. We all know there were a lot of changes with VAMP. We're going to do a high-level overview of those changes. The final changes happened the beginning of April around VAMP, and we'll dive into those and how that affects your actual strategy. And then we'll, of course, have time for Q&A as well. So let's start with the evolution. I always say that chargebacks really started the process in a manual way, trying to recover as much funds as possible, pulling the data from multiple sources, multiple interfaces. Many merchants still work this way today. I was on calls yesterday with very large merchants still manually pulling data and from multiple sources and then taking that data and manually building evidence. Now, on one end, you can really, if you have a strong team of analysts, they can really tailor each and every response for you and to try and get the highest win rate. But on the other side, you have to limit the amount of time you can give them to actually handle the case in order to keep it ROI positive. And chargeback volumes fluctuate. So myself, who has handled chargebacks in a manual way, I had a great team of 20 individuals, volumes went through the roof, and I couldn't get to all the cases. So I either left the small dollar value cases on the table, or I shrunk the templates that my team was working off of. We shrunk them to at least submit something instead of just getting a 0% win rate. So it really made it challenging to build a scaled solution. The team just kept growing as our volumes were growing, but also fluctuating volumes made certain months where I had too much work that the team couldn't get to, and other months where I didn't have work for the team. So that was really challenging. Now, then came along the automation process, which was great. It gave us scale, automating a template, taking a template and injecting the data into that template. You can really bring a solution to scale in that way. The problem with that is you lose the ability to tailor each and every case and the way it deserves to be tailored. So you get the scale, but you don't get the results. If you don't have it tailored, the actual results you'll see in your chargebacks will be definitely a lot lower than you deserve. So what we saw is the next stage, and this is really where Just came in and revolutionized the space, was bringing in AI dynamic argument automation, what we call the ability to scale in a smarter way. And what we're doing is it's like a human is handling each and every case without any human error, because the system is picking and choosing which arguments to use, in what order to put those arguments that will give that specific case the highest chance of being ruled in the merchant's favor. It's taking into account the reason code, the card scheme, the PSP it's going through, the issuer reviewing it, and the data available. Sometimes data can hurt a case, and in another scenario, that same data can help the case. So the system is smart enough to do that at scale, but also it allows us to run tests behind the scenes and optimize and improve the solution. However, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, it's mentioned balancing alerts and chargeback recovery. And since solutions like Verify and Ethoca have been in the market, there has always been that question, not only handling your chargebacks in a smart way, as I discussed at the moment, is how do I incorporate that with my alert solutions to stay below the limits so I don't pass the card scheme limit. So that's always been a question, always something to look at. But we really saw a change and a bigger focus around this in 2025 when Visa came out with the new VAMP ratios. And when they came out with those new VAMP ratios, we realized there's additional things to look at when you're figuring out how to do that balance. And we're really going to dive into those details. That is going to be the core of the session today, really focusing in how VAMP affects your ratios and how you can look at your ratios in different ways and how you can balance it properly. And finally, the last session we did, the last webinar, was about what we call the AI-driven case selection to maximize your ROI. If anybody missed that session, you can see the recording of that session, really showing what cases you should fight and what cases you shouldn't if you either have a manual team handling your cases or you're actually you're getting fees for fighting and losing a case. So let's dive deeper into the balance of alerts and chargeback recovery. The challenge really stands with you want to stay below the fraud and chargeback limits, especially with the new VAMP ratios, but you also don't want to overuse these alert solutions that can help you stay below the limit. So, of course, I call it a phased approach. You first want to look at how do you keep your fraud and chargeback ratios low enough, looking at how your verification process works, what are your fraud strategies. Then if you're doing all of those and you're still close to the limits, then you can implement the alert solutions as well. But in order to figure out if you need to implement the alert solutions, you really need to have the strategy first of how do you actually monitor your ratios, which can be challenging because you don't only need access to your chargeback data, but you need access to your TC40 data, which Sarah will explain in a second. Once you know what your ratios are like, then that can give you that picture. Do you even need solutions like Verify and Ethoca alert solutions? Because we've seen it many times today in the market. Merchants will come to us and they're either overusing these alert solutions or they're just using the alert solution and they're not even fighting the other chargebacks that are coming in. So alert solutions are great, but maybe you don't even need them in the first place if you're below the limits. And if you are below the limits, maybe fighting your chargebacks is the way to go, and it's worth doing an analysis to see what is the best process forward. Once you have done that, and you do see that you need an alert solution, you have to define which traffic it should be used, the alert solution. Really making sure you have that balance, especially with VAMP, because now VAMP is based off of count and not dollar amount. If you can actually understand where those lower ticket value cases should be refunded through the alert solutions, then you can leave the higher ticket values to recover through the chargeback process. But you have to have on the back end a chargeback solution in place that's scalable and smart enough to give you the tailored responses you deserve to do that balance. So having the alerts and having the proper chargeback solution in place. So I'm going to ask Sarah a few questions now around being a merchant yourself in the industry at Super. You built the chargeback process there. And can you tell us about building that chargeback process? Was it manual? And what challenges arose through the process?
Yeah, great question. So I came to super.com about 5 years ago, and it's an online travel agency. And when I took over chargebacks, it was a manual process. So we had some basic templates. We had some basic internal tools that helped us get the chargebacks in and out of our PSP, but we had a team of analysts that really had to handle each and every case, decide how we were going to approach that case, potentially add more evidence, add custom notes onto it. And so it was very manual. But the business was just growing so fast on the travel side. And then we also added subscriptions. And those are exactly those high volume, low value cases that you mentioned, Ronen. And in many, many subscription businesses, the chargeback rate is high. You get a lot of cases. And so with the volume growing, it was very challenging for our team to keep up with it. And so we really had to turn to automation. And we first got some basic RPA tools that sped up what I call a lot of the, button clicking processes between the different systems we needed to go to. But it really wasn't a full, robust, comprehensive solution. And that's why I started looking at Just because we really wanted to replicate, the smart decision making of our analysts, but we wanted to do it at scale, fully automate it. And that's what Just enabled us to do. And it was really helpful as a seasonal business. We had pretty much unlimited capacity with Just during our peak seasons coming off of, summer travel. So we could handle as many cases as needed. We didn't have to accept small cases because of bandwidth concerns. So yeah, we really moved to the fully automated process with Just.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, Sarah. And as a merchant, did you also use the pre-dispute solutions like Ethica and Verify?
Yeah, we did. And this is something over my tenure at Super, we used more and in different ways, a lot because of how VAMP came into the picture. But we had to be very strategic with it because it is expensive and there are real trade-offs. So yeah, we first implemented Ethica, and then as VAMP came out, we implemented RDR. But with both of those, we had a really careful strategy designed to make sure we're managing our chargeback ratios in line with our business goals.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you say to do it in line with your business goals, were you able to balance when to use alerts and when to let something turn into a chargeback?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is, a common goal for high growth businesses. We definitely want to keep our ratio below the VAMP threshold and below the other network's threshold, but we want to give ourselves an opportunity to fight as many cases as possible because that's where we can get the best ROI, and that's where we could really defend ourselves from a lot of the friendly fraud that comes in. And so I would continuously monitor our data and find where was the sweet spot to set our threshold for using alerts. And I would, constantly work with our partners to adjust the threshold for alerts. So we weren't over refunding on alerts. We were strategically managing it. So in my experience, it's really, really important to know your data, know your target, and just continuously monitor that. It's definitely not a set it and forget it process.
Definitely. I don't think anything in the chargeback process is a set it and forget it. That's such a good point. When you were trying to do this balance, what were the biggest challenges that came up between balancing the alerts and chargebacks?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. The sometimes the prices of the alerts are changing. So it's important to stay on top of those. It's also challenging in a seasonal business because you have to take into account the chargeback volume and the transaction volume. And then some of the networks, particularly MasterCard, they are measuring the transaction volume for the prior month compared to the chargebacks for the current month. And so that can make it a little bit more complicated to manage. So yeah, just being on top of what is every network's ratio. Also getting access to the data can be a big challenge. I found it was really important to invest time in setting up dashboards that were repeatable. So we didn't have to go in and, do complex data pulls every month. I kind of just had the data on demand. So yeah, setting up repeatable processes to easily get the data really helped to overcome a lot of those challenges.
Yeah, those are great challenges you mentioned, especially the changes. Everything in the chargeback space is constantly changing, whether it be the fees, the rules, and the ratios now that we're seeing. And it's going to be interesting to see if MasterCard does changes as well around the ratios. Now that Visa did VAMP. What would be your tips to a merchant that is deciding between fighting chargebacks and using the alert solutions?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it definitely, my number one tip is just going back to understanding what is your business goals. There are trade-offs between your chargeback rate and other parts of your payment performance, like your auth rate. So, um, if you want to like minimize your chargeback rate to help boost your auth rate, that might be one objective. But if you want to tolerate as big of a chargeback rate as possible, as allowable by the networks, and maximize, your ability to recover your chargebacks. You really want to understand, what is the best strategy for your business, what is aligned with the bigger business goals, and then kind of set your chargeback strategy along with that. I would say the other thing is there are so many different ways to get alerts. You can go direct with Ethoca and Verify. You can work through some of the other service providers that you're using in the fraud and risk space, but it is really helpful in my experience to consolidate your vendors as much as possible and use automation with your alerts. When I first started with alerts, I was going direct through Ethica and I didn't have any other system integrations, so it was a very manual process. And for example, Just now has the alerts integrated into our portal with a full suite of automation, so we can automate even the refunds and some other pieces of it. So it's really important to think about, beyond just the alert itself, how else do the alerts affect your process and how can you automate that and consolidate it to make, you and your team's workflow as easy as possible.
Great point, Sarah. I'm actually going to pass the mic over to Sarah now, who's going to walk us through VAMP and the changes in VAMP.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Roenen. So yeah, just a little bit of an overview on VAMP. This was a new program that Visa launched in 2025, and the goal was really to remediate excessive fraud. The effect for merchants was that the VFMP and VDMP programs of the past were consolidated into a single program that is actually monitored at the acquirer level, and there are ratios for acquirers and merchants. Um, and the ratios are fundamentally different than anything we've worked with before. And the tools that we've listed here, like RDR, Ethoca, and a couple of other ones, have fundamentally different effects on the ratio than they've had before. And so they became even more critical to understand how they work and critical to use, very precisely and strategically. So this has been a really hot topic in the merchant community for the last year or so. And then as of this month, as of April 1st, the threshold tightened down to 1.5% for merchants. It used to be 2.2. And so, this is kind of a really good time to have this discussion because this is essentially a new era of VAMP that we're entering. So now I want to dive into the actual VAMP calculation a little bit more. It is really important to understand the components of this calculation and really important to understand, your company's data and monitor this VAMP ratio over time. The first thing I want to start with is there is a minimum count of 1,500 required to enter the program. So you want to be aware of that. But everything VAMP related, keep in mind it is monitored at the acquirer level as well. And so what you're seeing here is the official Visa version, but your acquirer may still monitor you even if you're under 1,500, even if you have a lower threshold. So it's really important to discuss this with your acquirer and understand their expectations. So there's essentially three components of this ratio. And I'll start with TC40 in the numerator. That's definitely the most interesting one and the one that's, thrown everybody for a loop the most of all. And this is the reported fraudulent transactions for the month. And these may or may not have been chargebacks, have become chargebacks. And these are totally separate reporting from your chargebacks. And so the action item for merchants here is to work with your acquirer to make sure you get reporting on this because it's not in any of your standard chargeback reports typically. The second component is the monthly count of TC15s. This is all of your chargebacks, including fraud and non-fraud reason codes. And so you may be thinking, wait, it sounds like fraud is being double counted. And you're exactly right. Fraud is being double counted in both TC40 and TC15 if it becomes a chargeback. So that is one of the things that makes VAMP so challenging, but you can use RDR to get rid of the TC15s from your VAMP ratio. And so that is one really, really important, strategy to help manage your VAMP ratio. But it is much harder to get rid of the TC40 side of the equation. We'll talk about that if we have time. And then in the denominator, we have TC05s. This is pretty straightforward. This is just your monthly settled transactions. And that's based on transactions in the same month. Yeah, all of this is the same month of transactions. And as I mentioned, the threshold went to 1.5% as of April 1st. I think we can go to the next slide. So I've mentioned that the tools are a really important part of the VAMP strategy. As I mentioned, CDRN, Ethoca, and RDR will keep TC15s out of your VAMP ratio, but not TC40s. To attack TC40, you need to look into some of the other Visa tools, specifically CE 3.0, which stands for Compelling Evidence 3.0. That is a more complex tool. It's not an alert. It's more of a data sharing tool that you set up with Visa and with your issuer to try to identify cases of friendly fraud. So it's really important to kind of reemphasize Ronen's points. You want to be strategic about how you use these tools, but with VAMP being so challenging for merchants, these are an important part of the strategy. So definitely important to work with your partners, find the right solutions based on, your specific data, your specific needs and strategy. Next slide, please. Just a couple of VAMP pitfalls I wanted to quickly mention. First, assuming you're too small to be monitored, even though there is that 1,500 threshold, since the acquirers have their own threshold that is actually stricter than merchants, they're going to be monitoring their whole portfolio. So make sure you're working with your acquirer to understand their expectations. Next one is underestimating post-holiday chargeback risk. This is a really common point. We see spikes coming in from merchants, so be prepared for this. Next one is relying on PSPs to notify you when approaching the limits. In my experience, this doesn't always happen, so it's really important to be proactively monitoring these yourself so you can understand if you're having any issues and stay in front of them. And then last but not least, overusing pre-dispute solutions like RDR and CDRN. They can be an important part of the VAMP strategy, but they have a lot of trade-offs. They are expensive, they have a cost for each alert, and most importantly, you lose your ability to fight the chargebacks. So you really want to do a data analysis to find the right strategy for you to help you meet your overall goals instead of just, using these across the board. I think that is it for the VAMP section. I will hand it back to you, Ronen.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all that, Sarah. Great points. When you were a merchant dealing with this, and I know VAMP came out when you were still on the merchant side, did you change your strategy at all due to the VAMP changes?
Oh, definitely. Over, the year or so leading up to VAMP, that was one of my main initiatives. So I worked, cross-functionally to make quite a few changes. And I just wanted to highlight two changes specifically within chargeback operations and strategy. First, we had been using Ethoca for a while. And I think it's pretty well known as primarily a MasterCard tool. But with the focus on VAMP, we really needed to understand how exactly does Ethoca work with Visa because we knew there was some coverage. And so one specific question we had was if we use Ethoca to squash a Visa case, does it still go on TC40? And what we found was that the official SOP from Visa tells the issuers they should still put it on TC40, but that is not consistently applied. So we went down to the issuer level and did a data analysis to figure out which Visa issuers will put closed Ethoca alerts onto TC40 and which won't. And then we actually mirrored our Ethoca automation to follow what we saw in that data. So we got really, really precise on that. And then another change we made was to implement Visa Compelling Evidence 3.0 to try to really target our friendly fraud and keep cases off of TC40 in the beginning. That was very data intensive, a lot of work with data engineering. So that can be very challenging for merchants from my firsthand experience.
Oh, that's an amazing scenario of really understanding how each issuer works in each scenario and tailoring it to the T. What I'm going to do now is run through a quick exercise. I know we only have a few minutes left, and if anybody wants to stay, we'll do some questions when we hit the 30 minutes as well. I'm going to show you three different scenarios and why it's so important. It really shows why it's so important to balance your ratios properly and to be balancing chargebacks and alerts as well. So let's look here. We have a merchant that has around 100,000 settled transactions a month, 500 TC40s and 1,400 TC15s. You see that at the right side of the screen. So when we do their calculations, they have 1,900 TC40s and TC15s a month, which puts them at a 1.9% VAMP ratio. Based off of the new rules that started in April 1st, they are past the limits and they're currently not using any of the alert tools. So when we go to merchant B, they're using the alert tools, but it looks like an overusage of the alert tools. Same scenario, but with all of the TC15s, they were able to reduce 1,300 of those TC15s because they built the rule around RDR that all cases below $100, they're going to auto refund through the RDR process. So that means they've eliminated those 1,300 TC15s. But now they're in a scenario where their TC40 and TC15 count is well below the limits, the 1,500 limit that Sarah mentioned. Now they're at 600, and their VAMP ratio is at 0.6%. That's a great, healthy ratio to be at, but they've just refunded quite a lot of transactions and paid the fee to do those refunds, as Sarah mentioned before. So let's show a healthier way to work. If you can see what your trend is in regards to the dollar amounts you're receiving in each category each month, you can actually tailor it to a better way. So let's look here, same scenario, but instead of refunding all cases, using the RDR for all cases below $100, this scenario is below $50. So it's only refunding 800 cases instead of 1,300 cases. This keeps them still below the limits. They're at 1,100 TC40s and TC15s a month, and at a 1.1% ratio. 1.5 is the actual percentage that you need to stay below, so they're below the limits. But if we look here at the bottom, what's really exciting about this is there's an additional 500 cases now that are worth around $100 that they can fight each month when they work in this way. So that's $50,000 worth of chargebacks that they can fight and try to recover a percentage of those cases. If we multiply that by 12, that's around $600,000 a year that can be cases that are worth fighting and recovering on your behalf. So really doing this balance can really be hundreds of $1,000s and even millions of dollars for certain merchants. So you really need to do this balance properly to really get the highest ROI throughout the process. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to JC to see if there's any questions. If anybody wants to stay, I know we're a little over. Go ahead, JC.
Cool. Thanks, Ronen, and thank you, Sarah, for the super insightful session. I hope everyone found it very informative and helpful as we navigate through these changes in the industry. So let me pull up the Q&A real quick and see what we have in there. And again, if anybody has any other lingering questions at the moment, feel free to throw them in there. So to start, we have a question from the audience. How does Visa base the ratio calculations for VAMP? Are they per PSP, per descriptor, per mid? Yeah, great
Yeah,
question.
yeah, this is a great question because I was just in a conversation with a merchant about this, and it was really interesting is because we're talking about that. Even last year, I did 2 webinars with Visa, and they made it very clear in the webinars that they base it off of per PSP per mid. So if you're working on multiple PSPs, they do it per each PSP per mid. However, it's something to mention that Visa does as well as the other card schemes. There is their ability to go deeper, and if they can connect entities for the same merchant across mids and even across PSPs, you see this less happen in the industry. You'll see it more with across mids. They can look at the ratio across multiple mids. So let's say you're using the same descriptor across multiple mids in the same PSP, then they can calculate all of those together. So I always say you need to calculate your ratios per PSP per mid, but you also should be looking at the scenario where they're actually put together as well to see if you're still below the limits because they do have the ability to connect them together.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that when VAMP was first coming out, this is something, I had a lot of discussion with Visa about, my specific mids and descriptors. They were open to, hearing our case as to why different descriptors should be combined or not combined. So if you feel like you're in that situation, if you have a lot of different descriptors, especially dynamic descriptors, I would definitely recommend, trying to get in touch with your visa contacts, potentially through Verify to have that discussion. Just be prepared to have a business explanation of, why you think they should or should be aggregated or disaggregated.
Nice. I think this is quite an interesting question that we received. If we have received a high fraud and dispute rate from a specific issuer, is it a good strategy to block or stop receiving payments from that issuer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give my insights, Sarah. Feel free to answer as well. It's really it's a challenging scenario, right? Because on one side, you feel like you found the problem and you can just block the problem that you found. On the other side, you're also going to be blocking good transactions if you just fully block that issuer, and that's why you need a more dynamic fraud solution in place that can really decide when to block and when to block, not to block transactions. But Sarah, if you have anything else to add, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you, Ronan. And what I would add is like, you know, um, go down to the bin level and also think about other factors. Like, is it, a prepaid card and you're talking about a subscription? Or is it, that bin is really driving a significant portion of your chargebacks and it's gonna make or break you getting into VAMP? I think you need like a very specific rationale. And yeah, to your point, Ronan, look at the trade-offs. How is it going to affect, your revenue, and are you willing to make that trade-off? So I think it's a complicated question, and it requires a lot of data analysis and analysis of the trade-offs.
Fair enough. Great answers. Thank you, both Sarah and Renan. I think we'll do one more. I know obviously we're over for time, but we have some more questions in there. We're going to get to one more, and if there's any additional questions, we'd be happy to answer them offline. Um, this question says, VAMP has thresholds not only to stay below 1.6%, but is it healthy to stay below 1.6% only, or should merchants not aim to stay in 0%, for example? So I think the question is like, where's the healthy range to be?
Yeah. So it's 1.5%, not 1.6%, but as we mentioned, it's 1,500 TC40s and TC15s and 1.5% in regards to your ratio. But I really liked what Sarah mentioned is check with your PSPs. The healthy range is really to understand, because there's stricter limits for the acquirers and payment processors, understand if your acquirer has an actual stronger limit than that they expect you to be below. We've had several merchants come to us and say, I'm staying below the limits and I got this warning from my acquirer. And it's better to be more proactive, and instead of getting the warning, and see what is the actual target you should be hitting. And each one of your acquirers may have a different target because they have different traffic that's flowing through them, and they may have different risk appetites themselves.
Well said. All right, cool. We have that's all we had time for today. I do appreciate everyone joining and sticking around past the 30-minute mark. Thank you for joining our webinar titled Optimizing Your Chargeback Strategy, Balancing Alerts, Recovery, and VAMP. Thank you both, Ronan and Sarah, for joining us and all your helpful insights and education. Super, super grateful for you being here today. And a special thank you to everyone who joined. As a reminder, we will be sending out a recording of the session soon, so we hope to see you in our next webinar. But this concludes today's session. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. I hope you have a good morning, day, evening, whatever is relevant for you wherever you are. Take care.